we have been discussing this paper, Introduction to Philosophy, which is introduced in the first semester for the students of philosophy, University of Delhi under the UGCF NEP syllabus. We continue today to discuss about the various themes under this paper, specifically Unit 4, where we discuss social contract, the theory of justice, and the scientific rigor. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, when we talk about social contract, or when we talk about the justice in between and followed by the scientific rigor, let us first pick up the part which is about justice. And when we talk about justice, let us concentrate on something that we address as epistemic justice. Now, this term epistemic justice is mostly associated with Miranda Fricker, who identifies two central forms. First, testimonial justice vis-a-vis injustice, where a speaker's credibility is unjustly deflated due to prejudice. Example could be caste, gender, class bias. There is also the hermeneutical injustice. Now, in this hermeneutical injustice, this is a gap in collective interpretive resources that prevents someone from making sense of their experience. Epistemic justice demands fair recognition of individuals as knowers, equal participation in meaning-making practices. Now, here we must understand that education plays a crucial role. Education is just not neutral, it is a structured epistemic environment where knowledge is selected, that is curriculum, authority is distributed, teacher versus student, voices are legitimized or silenced. Therefore, education can either reproduce epistemic injustice or act as a site of epistemic repair. Now, when we talk about the philosophical dimensions of epistemic justice in education, we see they come under ontological, which is the student as knower. Traditional education treats students as passive recipients. Epistemic justice redefines them as active epistemic agents. Here, every learner brings lived experience, cultural knowledge, interpretative frameworks. Denying this is a form of epistemic injustice. So, the question then is, what counts as knowledge? Mainstream education often privileges canonical, Western, formal knowledge, while marginalizing indigenous knowledge, oral traditions, experiential insights. If we are to connect the epistemological knowledge with, say, our Indian epistemologists like D.P. Chattopadhyay, we see that for them, knowledge is historically and culturally embedded. Scientific temper must engage diverse traditions critically. Thus, epistemic justice requires pluralizing knowledge without collapsing the standards of reasoning. This brings us to the notion of ethical. The ethical here is recognition and respect. Epistemic injustice is fundamentally moral harm, being disbelieved, which is loss of dignity, being misunderstood, which is alienation. So, ethically, it is demanded that we need to respect students as credible informants and foster intellectual dignity. We also have the political setup vis-a-vis power and knowledge, where knowledge systems are shaped by power. Curriculum reflects dominant ideologies. Language of instruction privileges certain groups. Institutional hierarchies silences dissent. epistemic justice thus ought to involve redistributing epistemic power. Now, the role of epistemic justice in education, we see it is correcting testimonial injustice, where teachers must critically examine biases. Classroom participation must be inclusive. For example, encouraging marginalized students to speak, taking their contributions seriously. That builds epistemic confidence. When we address or try to address the hermeneutical gaps, we see that they expand interpretative frameworks in curriculum, introduces concepts that help students articulate lived realities. For example, gender studies enabling articulation of discrimination. Social theory explaining structural inequality. Education thus becomes a space of self-understanding. Cultivating epistemic virtues can be traced when we are drawing it from epistemology, including some of the epistemologists like Duncan Pritchard's, where his virtue framework emphasizes on intellectual humility, open-mindedness, critical reflection, and these are essential for scientific temper and democratic reasoning. Now, that enables the dialogical pedagogy, where we see a shift from monologue to dialogue. Knowledge emerges through interaction, so classroom becomes a mini public sphere, a site of shared reasoning. And that leads to what we call as the democratizing knowledge. Epistemic justice aligns with accessibility, which is open resources, inclusivity, that is diverse voices, participation, where there is student engagement, and knowledge is no longer owned by elites but co-created socially. There are also challenges and tensions to this side. For example, relativism versus standards. Thus, recognizing multiple knowledges undermine truth. What is the way out? The way out perhaps would be to maintain standards of evidence and reasoning, but expand who participates in knowledge production. Authority versus equality, where teachers possesses expertise and that can be balanced with authority as guidance, not domination. Encourage questioning without collapsing rigor. Structural constraints could, of course, and there are the exam systems, institutional hierarchies, language barriers. Epistemic justice requires systematic reform, not just individual goodwill. So, some of the broader implications that we see are that it is linked to social justice, where epistemic injustice reinforces vis-a-vis economic inequality, political exclusion. Education becomes a site of justice, not just instruction. Link to scientific temper, where we understand that with scientific temper, it does require free inquiry, critical reasoning. Without epistemic justice, only a few can question, others remain passive. Thus, there has to be also the democratic citizenship. Democracy, as we understand, depends on informed, reasoning citizens. Equal participation in discourse, epistemic justice is foundational to deliberative democracy. The role of epistemic justice in education is transformative. It redefines who counts as a knower. It reshapes what counts as knowledge. It redistributes who gets to speak and be heard. And the final insight is this, that education becomes just not when it merely distributes knowledge, but when it restores the right to know, to question, and to be understood. So then, what is at stake? Let us try to figure this out. The scientific temper, as articulated by Nehru and philosophically developed by D.P. Chattopadhyay, involves rational inquiry, critical skepticism, openness to evidence, freedom from dogma. The challenge is, can traditions often be seen as spiritual or metaphysical, contributing to this rational ethos? Number 2, breaking the false binary, tradition versus reason. A superficial view assumes a tradition to be faith, authority, dogma. Science is all about reason, critique, evidence, and philosophical correction, where Indian philosophical traditions are not monolithic. They include rigorous logic, nyaya, empiricism, Buddhist pramana theory, dialectics, madhyamaka, and therefore Indian thought already contains internal resources of rationality. Now, when we consider the epistemological contributions, we see that plural theories of knowledge like the Pramanavada, here the Indian systems asks, how do we know? They identify multiple pramanas, which is a means of knowledge: perception, pratyaksha; inference, anumana; testimony, shabda; and philosophical enrichment, where modern scientific temper often privileges empiricism plus experimentation. Indian traditions add nuanced analysis of testimony and interpretation, recognition of contextual knowledge. This enriches scientific temper by making it more self-reflective about its epistemic limits. Now, Nyaya, when we talk about the logic and the critical reasoning, we see that the Nyaya school develops the formal logic, where there is the debate structures, the vada, criteria for valid inference, and of course the contribution is that it encourages argumentation and critical scrutiny. It rejects blind acceptance of authority. Nyaya thus aligns strongly with scientific temper and rationality as disciplined reasoning. In the Buddhist epistemology, experience and reflexivity, we see thinkers like Dignaga and Dharmakriti emphasizing direct experience, pratyaksha, logical inference, critical examination of cognition itself. And the contribution thus is that it introduces reflexive awareness. How do our perceptions get constructed? This anticipates modern concerns about biasness, cognitive error. Now, when we choose or see the Charvaka, we see about what we call as radical skepticism. It rejects inference beyond perception. It critiques religious authority, and the contribution is that it encourages skepticism towards metaphysical claims. It challenges dogma, and it is a vital ingredient of scientific temper, and doubt is used as methodology. So, ethical and existential enrichment, as we can see, is when the scientific temper is often seen as value neutral, but Indian tradition introduces the ethical depth. Knowledge and ethics, in many Indian systems, knowledge or jnana is linked with liberation or moksha and ethical transformation. And the contribution is that knowledge is not just instrumental, which is controlling or prediction, but also transformative, self-understanding. Scientific temper becomes not just knowing the world, but also knowing oneself. And then we have intellectual humility, where traditions like Advaita Vedanta emphasizes limits of conceptual knowledge, openness to revision. And the contribution is that it counters scientific arrogance, encourages epistemic humility. There is also the dialogical culture where Indian philosophy, it goes through debate, also public reasoning, and this aligns with democratic discourse, scientific inquiry as a collective process. D.P. Chattopadhyay, however, argues that scientific temper is not aligned to India. It must be rooted in historical experience and cultural traditions. Rationality for him is not abstract. It is historically situated. Therefore, Indian traditions can ground scientific temper socially and culturally. Also, there is a critical caution to avoid romanticization, where to say that Indian traditions enriched scientific temper is not to say all traditions are rational or all beliefs are scientifically valid. There are problems within tradition, which is to do with superstition, hierarchical authority like caste, patriarchy, resistance to critique. Therefore, traditions must be engaged critically, not reverentially. So, we need to go towards a synthesis, which is expanding scientific temper from narrow empiricism to plural, reflective rationality. Integrating reason and context from the Western science, which uses majorly universal methods, Indian traditions that uses majorly contextual reasoning, and they together can give us a more holistic epistemology. So, when we go by the democratizing rationally, we use indigenous traditions to make scientific temper culturally resonant, reach broader populations, and that is vital. Thus, when we are tempted to ask questions like can Indian philosophical traditions enrich scientific temper, we know by now that it is yes, it can, but in a critical and dialogical way. For they contribute epistemic pluralism, logical rigor, reflexive awareness, ethical depth. Thus, scientific temper becomes richer when it is not uprooted from culture, but when culture itself is transformed into a space of critical reasoning. If we look at the PPT here, we see that the comparison between the Indian tradition and the Western philosophy, the dimension of the aim of knowledge in Indian tradition has largely been about liberation or moksha, understanding, and Western philosophy has largely been about explanation, prediction, control. Again, about relation to ethics, Indian tradition is integrated and Western philosophy is often separated. So, the scientific temper emerges differently. In the West, it is a methodological rigor. In India, it is a philosophical, ethical rationality. Similarly, for the nature of reason in Indian tradition, it is contextual and plural. In Western philosophy, it is universal and formal. The epistemology in Indian tradition is that it is there are multiple pramanas. In Western philosophy, it emphasizes on empiricism and rationalism. The method in Indian tradition is dialogical, dialectical. In Western, it is analytical and experimental. So, coming back, we see that epistemology thus is a means of knowledge. And from the Western tradition, if we pick up philosophers like Francis Bacon, we see him being the harbinger of the isms like empiricisms, induction, René Descartes, all about rationalism, the methodology of doubt, David Hume about skepticism, about causation. Thus, knowledge is grounded in observation, experimentation, and logical reasoning. So in Indian traditions, Nyaya thus is all about inference and logic, and Buddhists' epistemology is all about perception and inference, and Mimamsa is all about testimony or shabda as valid knowledge. Knowledge thus includes empirical, logical, linguistic, and social. So Western thought narrows focus to empirical verification, and Indian thought broadens it to epistemic pluralism. The enrichment of both thus is that scientific temper becomes more self-aware about limits of perception and the role of language and testimony. Similarly, when we talk about skepticism and doubt in the Western line, we have the Descartes' method of doubt, Hume's radical skepticism, boiling down to the doubt is methodological, a tool to secure certainty. In the Indian line, it is the Charvaka, where there is rejection of metaphysics. Buddhist, it is Madhyamika, a critic of all fixed views. So the doubt is ontological and existential, a way to expose conceptual illusions. Thus, the comparative insight is in Western skepticism, it seeks certainty of the doubt. In Indian skepticism, it embraces openness and non-finality. Therefore, the enrichment is that scientific temper becomes less dogmatic and more open-ended. When we talk about the logic and argumentation in the Western logic, we see that it is mostly formal, symbolic logic as of that matter, like Aristotle's onward. There is also precision and abstraction. In Indian logic, Nyaya, it is a 5-step inference or syllogism. It is embedded in a debate, Vada tradition. And the comparative insight is that the Western logic, there is formal clarity. Indian logic is dialogical engagement. And the engagement, thus the scientific temper becomes not just about correct reasoning, but about reasoning in dialogue. So the science and experience in Western science, it is about objectivity, external observation, separation of subject and object, and Indian thought, it is about emphasis on inner experiences, especially in Buddhist and Vedantic traditions. Reflexivity, again, examining the Noah, where the comparative insight we can see is in the West, it is all about knowledge of the world. And in India or in the East, it is about knowledge of the world plus knowledge of the self. And the enrichment of both is scientific temper, thus includes awareness of cognitive biasness and reflexive critique of the observer. Now this, and there are many such themes that comes under the theory of justice, the social contract, and of course that we are discussing right now about epistemology. We will be connecting more of in this line in our next class. Thank you so much.